The London skyline glowed beneath a restless evening sky. In the heart of Westminster, television trucks idled outside a studio whose windows caught the shimmer of streetlights. Inside, the hum of cables, whispered instructions, and the faint click of cameras filled the air. It was a night that promised civility on paper and confrontation in practice. The guest of the hour, Prince Harry, had agreed to appear on Piers Morgan Live, a decision that puzzled many and intrigued even more. It had been nearly a year since Harry had last sat down for a major television appearance. His previous interviews had focused on service, purpose, and the importance of mental health. But tonight felt different. The audience expected fireworks, not philosophy. And the man across from him, Piers Morgan, had built a career out of turning questions into pressure points. In the green room, Harry sat quietly with a cup of tea untouched before him. The steam curled into the air and vanished. He had been briefed, of course. His communications advisor had repeated the same points over and over. Stay calm, speak to the cause, defend the truth, but don't fall into argument. He had nodded through all of it, though deep down he knew that preparation meant little in front of someone like Piers. Interviews like this one didn't follow scripts. They followed instincts, and Piers's instincts were sharp, honed by years of conflict television. Through the half-open door, he could already hear the man's familiar voice warming up the crowd. That booming timbre, halfway between charm and challenge, carried easily even through the studio walls. Tonight, Piers was saying, a conversation the world has been waiting for, candid, raw, and unfiltered. The Duke of Sussex joins me for an honest talk about life, loss, and truth. The audience applauded. The applause had that polite uncertainty of people unsure whether they were about to watch a dialogue or a duel. Backstage, Harry glanced at his reflection in the mirror. The man who looked back was not the prince from magazine covers or the rebellious figure from headlines. He was older now, calmer perhaps, but scarred by scrutiny. His jawline was firmer, his eyes steadier. He straightened his jacket, exhaled once, and said quietly to himself, "Stay steady." A producer appeared at the doorway. "We're ready for you, Your Grace." 2 minutes. He nodded, rose from his chair, and followed the corridor toward the stage. Each step echoed softly against the linoleum floor. The smell of coffee and studio paint hung faintly in the air. When he reached the edge of the stage, he saw Piers adjusting his earpiece, smiling broadly for the cameras. Their eyes met for a moment, an unspoken recognition of what both understood perfectly. This wouldn't be a conversation, it would be a test. The director's voice crackled in the overhead speaker. 30 seconds, cameras ready. Harry took his seat across from Piers, who greeted him with that trademark half-smile that always seemed to promise both warmth and danger. The set was strikingly minimalist. 2 armchairs, a small table between them, a backdrop of deep navy blue with subtle lighting. The tension wasn't visual, it was atmospheric. "Good evening," Piers began smoothly as the red light blinked on. "You've given many interviews over the years, but not here, not with me. So first things first, why now?" Harry smiled politely. "Because conversations matter." Even difficult ones, Piers leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Difficult ones are the only kind worth having, wouldn't you say?" "Sometimes," Harry replied, "but I'd like this one to be honest, not hostile." The audience chuckled softly, unsure if they were allowed to. Piers's grin widened. "Honest is all I ever ask for." Let's start there. For the first few minutes, the exchange flowed easily. Piers asked about Harry's ongoing Veterans Initiative, Service Forward. Footage rolled of rehabilitation programs, mentorship workshops, and ex-servicemen teaching young apprentices. Harry spoke clearly, passionately, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had seen both war and recovery up close. "I've always said service doesn't end when you hang up the uniform," he explained. "It continues in how you live, in how you help others find purpose again." The audience applauded. Piers nodded approvingly. "You know, I think that's something everyone can respect," he said. "But of course, your life hasn't exactly been ordinary service, has it?" The question lingered. Harry gave a small, patient smile. "I was privileged, yes. But I've also seen loss. I've seen how isolation can consume people, even those surrounded by attention. That's why I focus on purpose. It's the one thing that keeps all of us grounded." "Purpose," Piers echoed thoughtfully. "That's a word you use often. Purpose, truth, mental health. Some people might say those sound like slogans. Harry's expression didn't change. They're not slogans when you live by them. Piers raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the restraint. Well, fair enough. Let's talk about that life you live by. You've built something completely new in America. Netflix deals, documentaries, public speeches. Some people admire the independence. Others say it looks like monetizing privacy. How do you respond to that? The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The air grew tighter. The crowd stopped clapping. Harry tilted his head slightly. Monetizing privacy? I think that's a misunderstanding. My wife and I have spoken about experiences, not for profit, but for perspective. There's a difference. Piers's tone sharpened a little. And yet those experiences, your experiences, include criticism of the royal institution. Some say your family back home would rather you kept certain things private. Does that ever cross your mind before you speak publicly? Harry took a slow breath, his eyes steady on Piers. Of course it does. But what also crosses my mind are the years my wife was vilified in the press. The lies printed daily, the intrusion into our lives, into our children's lives. Privacy isn't silence, Piers. It's choosing what to share and what to protect. The words were calm, but they landed like quiet thunder. Piers nodded, but his eyes flickered with the instinct of a man who sensed an opening. But isn't it true that by speaking out, you invite more attention? You criticize the press, yet you sit here with me on one of the most watched programs in the country. I'm not here to attack the press, Harry replied. I'm here to say that journalism should have responsibility. You know that better than anyone, the audience murmured softly. Piers shifted in his chair, smiling as though to deflect the weight. Well, I've certainly had my share of criticism for saying what I think. But people might argue you're selective with your truths. When the stories favor you, you share. When they don't, you call it intrusion. Harry leaned forward slightly, his tone tightening, not angry, just deliberate. And when stories are distorted, when headlines are written to humiliate rather than inform, you've been in this business long enough to know how that works. It's not about sharing when it's convenient, it's about surviving when it isn't. That line drew a ripple through the room. For the first time, Piers hesitated. He adjusted his cue cards, breaking eye contact for a fraction of a second. Then, regaining composure, he said, I see your point. But there are some who'd say you're rewriting history, framing your choices as heroism rather than hurt. Harry smiled faintly. I'm not rewriting history. I'm simply refusing to let others write it for me. It was the kind of answer that didn't need applause, but it earned it anyway. The segment continued, but the tone had shifted permanently. What began as polite conversation had turned into quiet confrontation. Harry remained composed, never once raising his voice. Piers, known for pushing guests until they broke, seemed to recognize that this wasn't someone who would. As the first commercial break approached, the floor manager gestured from behind the camera. Piers leaned back, tapping his pen against his notepad. We'll be back in a moment. When we return, we'll talk about the personal, family, fatherhood, and what peace really means when the world won't give you any. The red light faded. The cameras powered down. Silence stretched between them. Piers broke it first, his tone low but still edged. You handle pressure better than most politicians, I'll give you that, Harry smiled faintly. Maybe because this isn't politics. It's life. Piers studied him for a moment. There was curiosity there, even respect, buried under the bravado. You know, people will say you came here to repair your image. Harry met his gaze. Or maybe I came here to remind people I'm still human. The director called for reset. The countdown resumed. When the lights came back up, both men wore the same expressions they had started with. Professional, composed, but aware that something deeper had already begun. In homes across Britain, people leaned closer to their televisions. They knew what was coming. It wasn't hostility. It was truth, meeting provocation, decency meeting spectacle. For the rest of the hour, one man tried to press, the other refused to bend. And by the time the closing credits rolled, the world had seen something rare. Two forces colliding and only one walking away with grace and tact. But that reckoning, that quiet storm, would come later. For now, the lights dimmed, the applause swelled, and Piers Morgan smiled for the cameras as Prince Harry shook his hand, steady, unflinching, unbothered. What neither man said aloud was what everyone watching already knew. This was only the beginning. When the cameras faded to black after the first segment, the studio did not relax. Crew members whispered to each other, hurrying between cables and cue cards. The audience shifted in their seats, half excited, half nervous about what they were watching unfold. Even off air, the tension stayed. It had that strange electricity that builds when civility is hanging by a thread. Prince Harry sat quietly, hands clasped in his lap. He had done hundreds of interviews, but this one was different. Piers Morgan was a master of provocation, and Harry could feel the subtle rhythm of his questions tightening with every round. Yet there was something else behind it too, curiosity, maybe even admiration. Harry could tell when a man was attacking him and when a man was trying to understand him, even if both sounded the same at first. Piers adjusted his tie, glanced toward the monitor, and leaned over to the producer. "We're going to start this next segment with family," he murmured. "Let's see how far we can go without crossing the line." The producer nodded nervously. They both knew the danger of that phrase. Crossing the line was how Piers had built a career, but this time the guest opposite him wasn't a politician or an actor seeking promotion. This was a man who had lost his mother to the very machine that fed the headlines. As the crew counted down to the return from break, the studio lights brightened again, washing both men in that same sharp white glow. The applause sign blinked, the audience obeyed, and the red camera light came alive. "Welcome back to Piers Morgan Live," Piers said smoothly. "We're here with the Duke of Sussex, Prince Harry, talking about life, purpose, and of course, the choices that have shaped him since leaving the royal family." Harry nodded politely. Piers leaned forward slightly, his tone casual but calculated. "Before we left for the break, we talked about purpose and privacy. I want to ask you something many people wonder about. You often speak of protecting your family from the press, yet your family, your wife and children, remain at the center of global attention. How do you protect them when you're constantly in front of cameras yourself?" Harry didn't rush to answer. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I can't control what the world pays attention to," he said finally, "but I can control what I give it. When I speak, I do it for causes, for the work that matters. What I don't do is invite strangers into my home or my children's lives. There's a line that I won't cross, even if others already have." Piers nodded, pretending to agree, though his expression suggested otherwise. "But critics say that line blurs when you release documentaries or give interviews about family life. You know how it looks, like you're telling people not to look while pointing the camera yourself." Harry met his gaze. His tone stayed calm, but his eyes hardened slightly. "There's a difference between telling your story and selling it, Piers. The press has sold my life for decades without my consent. All I did was reclaim my own voice." The audience stirred. Some nodded, others exchanged glances. The remark had weight. Piers smiled faintly, as though he had expected that response. "That's fair," he said, "but let's talk about the effect of those stories. When you and Meghan speak about what happened in the royal household, you're not just telling your truth. You're revealing the private lives of others who can't respond publicly. Doesn't that feel unfair?" Harry hesitated only a moment. "It would be unfair if I were attacking anyone. But what I've done is explain how institutions can fail people. There's a difference between accountability and accusation." Piers gave a slow nod. "Still, some of your relatives might feel that you've embarrassed them on the world stage." Harry leaned back, his expression steady. "Embarrassment is temporary. Silence can be permanent. I'd rather risk one than live with the other." The studio quieted. Even the camera operators seemed to pause. Piers broke the silence with a thin smile. "You've obviously thought a lot about all of this. But, forgive me, it sounds rehearsed. Do you ever get tired of defending yourself?" Harry gave a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Every day. But I learned that silence doesn't make people stop talking. It just makes them write your story for you." There was something in his tone that drew sympathy even from those who came expecting confrontation. It was quiet, not defiant, a tired honesty that carried its own kind of strength. Piers shifted again, flipping his cue card over. "Let's talk about your mother. You've often said her loss shaped your entire life. I can't imagine the pain of living through that under public scrutiny. But do you ever worry that by keeping that story alive in every interview, you're reopening old wounds for yourself and your family?" Harry's posture changed. He straightened slightly, his jaw tightening. The question had pierced something raw. "My mother's story isn't about pain anymore," he said softly. "It's about purpose. I talk about her because silence let her be defined by tragedy. She deserved more than that. She still does. Piers's voice softened almost imperceptibly. And do you think she'd approve of how you've handled everything, leaving the monarchy, speaking out? For the first time, Harry looked down. His thumb ran along the rim of his glass of water before he spoke. I think she'd understand. That's enough for me. The audience remained still, moved by the simplicity of it, but Piers wasn't finished. Do you ever think you've gone too far? He asked quietly. That maybe your effort to protect your family has come at the expense of others who were part of that family? Harry looked up slowly. The only people who can answer that are the ones I protect. My wife, my children, the rest is noise. The cameras caught the look in his eyes, controlled, almost weary, but unflinching. It wasn't anger, it was resolve. The producers in the control room exchanged glances. They knew what they were seeing, a battle not of tempers, but of wills. Piers pushed, Harry absorbed, every question sharpened, but every answer diffused without surrender. Piers leaned forward again. Let's be honest. Some of your critics, including myself, have said that you're obsessed with controlling the narrative. But isn't that what you accuse the press of doing? Harry smiled faintly. Maybe the difference is intention. You control a story to sell it. I try to control mine to survive it. That answer landed with such precision that even Piers hesitated before moving on. He adjusted his jacket, giving the faintest nod of acknowledgement. All right, he said, let's shift a bit. He took a breath, glancing at his next card. You've spoken about mental health more openly than any royal before you. Do you think your openness has helped destigmatize the issue, or has it made you more vulnerable to attack? Harry's eyes softened. Both. Vulnerability always invites attack, but it also invites understanding. I don't think you can have one without risking the other. Still, Piers said carefully, when you share so much about your emotional struggles, some might say you're undermining the traditional image of royalty, stoic, composed, never complaining. Harry's lips curved in a small smile. Maybe that image needed undermining. A few people in the audience laughed quietly. The moment lightened briefly, but the tension quickly crept back. Piers studied him. So you're saying the monarchy should change? I'm saying everything should evolve, Harry replied. Institutions survive when they adapt, when they stop pretending people are perfect. It was the kind of answer that made headlines the moment it left his mouth. The control room knew it. Editors would clip it, circulate it, and by morning it would sit at the top of every trending feed. Piers could feel it too. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, sensing he had touched the edge of something dangerous. So, if evolution means openness, would you ever consider reconciling publicly with your family? Or have those bridges been burned? Harry paused, choosing every word like it was a thread that could snap. Reconciliation isn't a performance. It happens quietly or not at all. But I'll never close the door on anyone. The simplicity of it silenced even Piers. He cleared his throat. That's a diplomatic answer. It's an honest one, Harry replied. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The camera zoomed slightly closer, framing the two men in contrast, the provocateur and the calm resistor. The lights glinted off the glass of water on the table. Time itself seemed to slow, and for the first time all evening, Piers Morgan appeared uncertain of what to say next. Finally, he smiled, the expression more subdued than before. You know, he said, people often call me confrontational, but you might be the most disarming guest I've had. Harry chuckled softly. That's because I'm not here to win an argument. I'm here to have a conversation. The red light above the camera flickered, signaling another commercial break. Piers exhaled and leaned back, rubbing his chin. You're harder to rattle than I expected. Harry glanced at him calmly. That's because you expect reaction. I've learned to respond instead. The producer counted them down again. 3, 2, 1, cut. The music faded in. When the segment ended, Piers's expression changed. Beneath the performance, there was something almost respectful. You know, you might just ruin my reputation, he said lightly. People might start saying I have a heart. Harry smiled, standing to stretch his legs. Maybe it was always there. Just buried under the ratings. The crew laughed softly. Piers smirked, shaking his head. You're sharper than you look. The floor manager signaled that they would return for the final half shortly. As the studio lights dimmed to standby mode, Harry walked toward the edge of the set, where a runner offered him a bottle of water. The crowd murmured quietly behind the barriers, waiting for what came next. From the corner of his eye, Harry caught Piers watching him, expression unreadable. For a fleeting second, there was no host, no guest, just two men on opposite sides of an invisible mirror. One had built a career from questioning others. The other had built resilience by surviving those questions. The break was nearly over. Piers turned back to the table, fixing his tie, his voice low. "The next part will get personal," he said. Harry nodded. "I figured. You sure you're ready?" "I've been ready for years." The red light blinked again, the applause sign lit. And just like that, the quiet before the storm was over. When the broadcast resumed, both men wore polite smiles again, but the space between them had changed. It carried history now, words unspoken, truths half revealed. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. Piers opened the next segment with his most dangerous weapon, charm. "Before we finish, I want to talk about love, loyalty, and how they survive under pressure. You've spoken about protecting your family, but what about protecting yourself? Where does your peace come from now, Prince Harry?" Harry looked directly into the camera, not at Piers, not at the audience, but at the unseen millions beyond the lens. "Peace," he said quietly, "comes from knowing that even when the world misjudges you, the people who matter never will." It was simple, it was final, and for a moment, just a moment, Piers Morgan said nothing. The studio lights seemed brighter now, harsher somehow, as if they too had sensed the tension gathering in the air. The soft politeness of the earlier segments had vanished, replaced by something sharper. It wasn't hostility, not yet, but the atmosphere had thickened enough that even the crew could feel it. Every camera angle was deliberate now, every pause heavy with meaning. Prince Harry sat upright, his posture calm but alert. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly each time Piers glanced down at his cue cards. He knew what that meant. The next line of questioning was coming, and it would be personal. Too personal. The red light blinked again. The audience quieted. Piers leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, and spoke in that deceptively casual tone that had made him both famous and infamous. "Harry, I think the world has heard plenty about your views on privacy, the press, and your causes. But let's talk about what everyone really wants to understand, you and Meghan, because frankly, people are divided. They look at you both and see contradiction." Harry didn't move. He just listened. His face gave away nothing. Piers continued, his words deliberate. "You say you want privacy, yet you live in the public eye. You criticize the monarchy, yet you still use the titles. You say you want peace, yet you've built a career around conflict. So which version is real?" There was a flicker of tension in Harry's eyes. Not anger, not surprise, just that familiar weariness of someone being misunderstood again. He inhaled slowly before answering. "Both are real. Because life isn't simple. Privacy doesn't mean hiding, it means choosing when to share and when not to. Titles don't define who I am, they're part of a system I was born into. And as for peace, you don't get it by pretending problems don't exist." Piers nodded slightly, but the faint smirk on his lips didn't fade. "But some would say you've built a platform out of complaining about your past. Do you ever wonder if that's what people see now, a man defined by grievance?" Harry leaned forward, his tone even but firmer than before. "If people think that, maybe it's because that's the only part the media ever shows them. You don't show the charity work, the community projects, the quiet parts. You only show what sells. Pain sells. Outrage sells. But healing doesn't make headlines, does it?" The words landed hard. The audience shifted, caught between fascination and discomfort. Pierce's grin tightened. "That's fair," he said. "But let's be honest, Harry. You've made choices that have consequences. You left the family business, let's call it that, and then went on global television to air grievances. You've criticized the institution that gave you everything. Some would call that betrayal." Harry's eyes flicked toward him, steady as stone. "Betrayal? I gave up the comfort of that world because it came with a price I wasn't willing to pay. My family's safety, my wife's peace, my own mental health. I didn't betray anyone, I protected them." That was the first moment when the audience applauded without being cued. The sound rose softly, filling the studio for a few seconds before fading again. Piers didn't smile this time, his gaze sharpened. And yet, critics would say Meghan knew exactly what she was marrying into. That she wanted the fame, the status, the spotlight. That she used you. Harry's expression hardened instantly. The crowd fell silent again. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence hang long enough for the air itself to grow heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but had that dangerous softness that comes when patience runs thin. "I married someone I love." I married someone strong enough to stand beside me when the world decided to tear us apart. And if people can't see that, it says more about them than it does about her." Piers leaned back slightly, adjusting his pen. "So you don't think she's ever made mistakes?" "Everyone makes mistakes," Harry said evenly. "But the difference is, some people's mistakes are forgiven quietly. Ours are headline news." It was said so simply, so directly, that even Piers hesitated. He wasn't used to his provocations being met with calm logic, but he wasn't done. "You know, I've been in this business a long time," Piers said, his tone quieter now, "and I've seen how public perception works. You've lost a lot of supporters in the UK. Even people who once admired you feel alienated now. Does that bother you?" Harry nodded slowly. "Of course it does. I grew up there. I love that country. I served it. But love doesn't mean you accept being treated unfairly. If standing up for my family costs me popularity, then I can live with that." "Even if it costs you your relationship with your father?" Piers asked suddenly. The question hit like a spark in dry grass. The studio's silence deepened. Harry's fingers tightened slightly around the arm of his chair. He didn't blink. "That relationship is between him and me," he said quietly, "not between me and the press." Piers pressed again, sensing the shift. "But surely you understand why people want to know. Your father is the king. Your decisions have public consequences." Harry looked directly at him. "What people call public consequences, I call personal pain. You can dress it up however you want, but at the end of the day, it's still a family." It was one of those moments that cut through the noise of television and hit straight at something human. Even Piers couldn't speak for a few seconds. The audience didn't clap, they didn't need to. Then finally, Piers said, "So you still see them as family, not an institution?" "Always," Harry replied softly. "But that doesn't mean I'll stay silent if that family or that institution allows harm to continue." There was a shift in the air again. The tension that had been growing now took a different shape, not confrontation, but clarity. Piers, for all his bravado, could feel it. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a reckoning, the kind that happens when truth refuses to hide behind diplomacy. Still, he tried once more to regain control. "Harry, let me ask you something as a journalist, not as a critic. Do you ever wonder if walking away cost you more than it gave you? That maybe the freedom you gained came with loneliness attached?" Harry's expression softened. "Of course. There are days when it feels heavy, but I'd rather live with loneliness than live a lie." Piers nodded slowly, as if digesting that. He shifted the papers on his desk, but didn't look down at them. His next words came slower. "Do you miss it? The palace, the family dinners, the life you left behind?" Harry's gaze drifted somewhere distant for a moment. "I miss the people," he said quietly, "the moments before it all became noise. But life changes. You either let it change you or you shape it yourself. I chose the second." For the first time that night, Piers seemed to ease his posture. "You know, you talk differently now. Less royal, more human. I mean that as a compliment," Harry smiled faintly. "Maybe that's who I was supposed to be all along." The cameras caught that smile, weary, genuine, and oddly disarming. It was a moment that would later flood social media, clips spreading across timelines with captions about resilience, redemption, and quiet strength. But the calm didn't last long. Piers turned another page in his notes. "Let's talk about Meghan again. A lot of people see her as the reason everything changed. Some say she pulled you away from your duty. Others say she saved you. Which is it?" Harry paused. He didn't look angry, but there was an unmistakable firmness in his gaze now. "Neither," he said. "She didn't pull me away or save me. She stood beside me, and for once I chose my own life." Piers looked like he was about to reply, but Harry wasn't finished. His voice deepened slightly, no longer polite or cautious, but certain. "You know, people talk about duty like it's a cage made of gold. But if it traps you long enough, it doesn't matter what it's made of. It's still a cage." The audience reacted audibly this time, gasping, clapping, murmuring all at once. The quote would later headline every article written about the interview. Piers leaned forward again, his tone lower now, almost admiring despite himself. "That's quite a statement, Harry." Harry met his gaze. "It's not a statement. It's reality." The two men stared at each other for a long moment. There was no hostility now, just a strange mutual recognition. They both lived their lives under relentless public scrutiny. They both had been praised, criticized, and misunderstood in equal measure. For all their differences, they were two sides of the same mirror, one reflecting provocation, the other endurance. But Piers wasn't ready to end it there. He leaned back again, crossing his arms. "All right then," he said, his voice picking up that familiar edge. "You've said your piece. But let me ask you one last thing before we break. Do you ever worry that by defending your family so publicly, you've actually made them more vulnerable?" Harry's eyes lifted toward him. "I don't worry about what people might do with my words. I worry about what silence already did." That answer silenced even Piers. The control room fell completely still. It was the kind of line that stopped conversation cold, not because it was clever, but because it was true. After a long pause, Piers finally cleared his throat and turned to the camera. "Well," he said with a faint, forced chuckle, "you can't say he doesn't speak his mind." "We'll be right back after this." The lights dimmed, the applause sign blinked again, but it was hesitant. The audience wasn't sure what they had just witnessed, an interview or a reckoning. As the cameras powered down, Harry exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Piers looked at him across the desk, the faintest glimmer of respect breaking through his guarded expression. "You know," Piers said quietly, "you didn't give me what I expected." Harry looked up. "That's because you expected anger. What you got was honesty." The floor manager called for a 5-minute break. The crew scattered. The air in the studio still hummed with something unspoken, the kind of energy that lingers when truth has been spoken out loud for the first time. Harry sat quietly, watching the empty audience rows as Piers turned away to check his notes. There was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction, only calm, because in the storm of questions, he had done what he came to do. He had defended what mattered, and the night was not over yet. The final segment began without fanfare. There was no opening music, no sweeping introduction. The lights dimmed slightly, softening the edges of the set. The cameras focused tight on the two men who had spent the evening locked in an unspoken duel. The earlier tension had changed shape. It was quieter now, heavier. It carried the feeling of a storm that had already passed but left its weight behind. Piers Morgan adjusted his papers, cleared his throat, and leaned slightly forward. His voice had lost its early sharpness. It carried something closer to curiosity than confrontation. "Prince Harry, we've covered a lot tonight. You've spoken about privacy, family, the press, and what it means to choose your own path. But I want to finish with something broader. After everything you've been through, everything you've said, do you think you've finally found peace?" Harry sat still for a long moment before answering. His eyes were fixed on something far beyond the studio, perhaps the world outside these walls. "Peace isn't a destination," he said finally. "It's a process. I've had moments of it, but I'm still learning. Every day, there's noise, judgment, speculation. But peace comes in moments, like watching my kids laugh or spending time outdoors away from cameras. Those moments remind me why I chose this life." The tone of his voice shifted the room. Even those who had come expecting confrontation found themselves listening differently now. Piers nodded, though his gaze lingered with a trace of skepticism. "You make it sound simple. But for someone constantly in the headlines, peace seems almost impossible." Harry smiled faintly. "That's because people confuse attention with importance. I used to think the same, but attention fades. What lasts is what you do when nobody's watching." The control room watched in silence. The director whispered something to a cameraman, but even she sounded subdued. They all knew they were capturing something rare, a television moment that felt more like confession than performance. Piers straightened slightly, his voice more deliberate now. "Let's talk about that attention. Whether you want it or not, people are fascinated by you. Some love you, others criticize everything you do. Do you ever think there's a version of this life where you could have stayed silent, stayed royal, and still been happy?" Harry didn't answer immediately. He clasped his hands together, his thumbs moving slowly against each other. "There might have been a version like that," he said finally, "but it wouldn't have been honest. And happiness built on silence doesn't last. I watched that happen to my mother. I couldn't let it happen again. Not to me, not to my family." That name, his mother's, hung in the air like a ghost. The room fell completely still. Piers's eyes flickered. He leaned forward, his tone gentler than anyone had ever heard it. "Do you still think about her when you do these interviews? When you sit in these chairs, facing people like me?" Harry exhaled slowly. "Every time. Not because I want to, but because I can't help it. Every flash of a camera, every headline that twists what I said, it reminds me of what she went through. She spent her life trying to be human in a system that doesn't let you be. I guess in a way, I'm still trying to finish what she started. For a moment, Piers didn't respond. His usual rhythm of quick questions and quicker rebuttals faltered. There was something in Harry's voice, not anger, not defiance, but deep, worn-out truth, the kind that doesn't need defense because it simply exists. Finally, Piers broke the silence. You know, people might not always agree with you, but it's hard to deny that you believe what you're saying. Harry smiled faintly. I don't need everyone to agree. I just need to be able to look in the mirror and know I didn't betray myself. The director in the booth signaled they had 5 minutes left, but neither man seemed to notice. The cameras zoomed closer. The lighting softened further, turning the harsh blue tones into something warmer. Piers leaned back slightly, tapping his pen on the desk. Let me ask you something personal. Do you miss your old life, the palace, the events, the structure? Or are you relieved to be out of it for good? Harry tilted his head, considering. I miss the people, not the system. I miss the moments before it became all about image. But I don't miss pretending to be fine when I wasn't. Do you think the monarchy itself can change? Piers asked. Harry thought for a moment, then said, It can, if it listens. But I think sometimes people confuse tradition with truth. Tradition can guide you, but when it stops serving people, it needs to evolve. I hope one day it does, the audience murmured quietly. They could feel the weight of that statement. It wasn't a criticism, it was a challenge, delivered without hostility, without bitterness. Piers sat back, studying him. For once, his usual smirk was gone. You know, he said, I've criticized you a lot in the past. You probably know that. But hearing you tonight, I get the sense you're not running from anything. You're just trying to live differently. Harry met his gaze. That's all I've ever wanted. A different life doesn't mean a better one or worse one. It just means it's mine. There was another long silence, the kind that only happens when something real has been said. Then, almost reluctantly, Piers leaned forward again. But surely you understand why people doubt you. Why they question your motives. You left an institution most people dream about. Some think you're ungrateful. Harry's voice stayed calm. I understand. But gratitude doesn't mean submission. I can be thankful for my upbringing and still want more for my family. It's not rebellion, it's evolution. He paused, then added quietly, when people say, I abandon duty, what they forget is that duty means nothing without humanity. That line hit the audience like a spark. A few clapped softly, though the applause was quickly hushed. Piers nodded, almost grudgingly impressed. That's a strong point. Harry smiled again, but this time it carried no triumph, only peace. It's just the truth. The director's voice crackled faintly through the earpieces. 2 minutes. Piers shuffled his papers, though it was clear he wouldn't use them again. All right, he said, his voice softer now, almost reflective. Before we close, I'll ask you this. What do you want people to remember about you when all of this noise is gone? When the cameras are off, the headlines fade, and there's just the story that remains? Harry's gaze steadied. I want them to remember that I tried. That I tried to protect my family, that I spoke when silence felt safer, that I loved without apology. I'm not perfect, but I've learned that perfection is a mask people wear to survive. I'd rather be real than royal. For the first time all evening, Piers had no comeback. He looked down at his notes, then back at Harry, as if seeing him not as a headline, but as a man. Well, he said finally, I don't think anyone can accuse you of not speaking your truth. Harry nodded slightly. That's all any of us can do. The camera light blinked again, signaling the end. Piers turned toward the lens. That was Prince Harry speaking with us tonight. Whatever you think of him, there's no denying he's one of the most talked about figures of our time. Thank you for joining us. The lights dimmed. The audience clapped politely, some genuinely, others unsure of what to feel. As the crew began to wrap up, Piers extended a hand across the table. Harry took it, firm and steady. There was no hostility left in the gesture, no tension, just two men who had shared a conversation that had gone further than either expected. Good talk, Piers said quietly. Harry gave a small nod. It was. Piers hesitated for a second. You know, I didn't think I'd say this, but you held your ground. Most don't. Harry smiled faintly. You push hard. But I've been pushed harder. Piers chuckled softly, shaking his head. I'll take that as a compliment. Harry rose from his chair, thanking the producers and the stage crew as he walked off the set. Behind him, the chatter of the studio slowly picked up again, lights powering down, microphones unclipped, footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Outside the studio, the London air was cold and sharp. The night sky shimmered with faint stars that were barely visible against the glow of the city. Harry pulled his coat tighter around him as the door closed behind him, cutting off the hum of cameras and applause. His driver waited by the curb, the car's headlights reflecting in puddles from an earlier rain. But for a moment, Harry didn't get in. He looked up at the dark skyline, his breath fogging in the air. The interview replayed in his mind, every question, every answer, every pause. For once, he felt no anger, no regret, only calm. Inside, Piers Morgan stood at the edge of the now empty set, staring at the chair Harry had occupied. He was silent too. It wasn't often that a guest left him without the last word, but tonight felt different. He had come expecting to expose contradictions, to provoke emotion. Instead, he had been confronted by something he hadn't planned for: sincerity. The control room lights dimmed, the monitors replayed the last few minutes of the show, Harry's final line echoing softly. "I'd rather be real than royal." It played again in the silence. By morning, the clip would flood the internet. Some would praise him for his composure, others would criticize him for his defiance. But the tone of the conversation had changed. For the first time in a long while, people weren't just arguing about what Harry said, they were listening to how he said it. The headlines would call it many things: Prince Harry's redemption interview, the moment that silenced Piers Morgan, a new chapter for the Duke of Sussex. But none of those labels mattered. What mattered was that, for one night, Harry had spoken without filters, without fear, and without permission. And the world had listened. As he finally stepped into the car and the door shut behind him, the city lights blurred in the reflection of the window. Somewhere in that glow, a quiet smile crossed his face. The war of words was over for now, but something more important had begun: understanding. The car pulled away into the London night, disappearing into the hum of traffic and streetlights. Behind him, the studio lights faded completely, leaving only the echo of truth lingering in the air.